Using multiple forms of art, text, and collage, much of Kathleen's work takes the form of mapping and explores walking as knowledge practice and artist's method. A deeply committed community art educator, Kathleen has developed creative projects with children, youth, adults, and seniors in sites of Montreal, Toronto, and the Netherlands, oriented to cultivating personal knowledge and awareness of building community. As Associate Professor of Art Education at Concordia University, Kathleen's research investigates the impact of the artist in the community and explores methods of artistic research. She holds an MFA in drawing and painting from Concordia and a PhD in education, with her award-winning doctoral research being the first practice-based dissertation at York University. So if you would please welcome her today. Her paper is entitled, as you can see, Cartographies of Self, Portrait and the Artist as an Urban Dog Walker.
Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed that, Andrea. I think you'll see some interesting connections with some of the things that I've been doing. So as Alicia said, I'm going to speak to you today as an artist about one of the works in my series of textile maps of walks in urban woods and green spaces. I walk these places in the company of my dog, who you can see here, a standard poodle named Baloo. I have thought of this series as jointly political, that is, about the political ecology of the urban forests I love, and personal, about the pleasures of my ongoing lived experience in these places. Only more recently have I also understood these textile maps to be a form of triangulated self-portrait, with myself construed relationally through the otherness of place and pet. So far, my series of work comprises 5 maps, including Toronto's Glendon Forest and the Montreal sites of the Morgan Arboretum, Angel Woods, Summit Woods, and the green space of the Lachine Canal parklands, which you see here in this winter image with Montreal skyline in the background. I'll speak today specifically about the Lachine Canal map, a profile of my desire to preserve room for the wild in the face of increasing building and gentrification. Just to give you a little backstory on where this project comes from, much of my own work can be described as place-based. I'm interested in questions of identity and belonging, with specific reference to corporeality, relationality, urbanity, the role of the more than human in the city, and the place of the wildish in contemporary Western life and imagination. A lot of my work is rooted in walking practice, not canoeing, but walking, with walking as a mode of knowing both place, multifariously construed, and self in connection to place. I frequently use the device of the map as a non-pictorial way to represent intersections of body, place, history, and lived experience. I began this series of maps in 2012, a few years after moving back to my birth city of Montreal and settling in Point St. Charles, which you'll see marked in red on the map here, a neighborhood in transition, as they say, adjacent to downtown. It was once a marshy floodplain along the St. Lawrence River. This terrain was reportedly visited by First Nations for seasonal hunting of birds in migration, a reason that it was once called Goose Village. The point was settled relatively early in Montreal's colonial history, not long after the old walled city started to prove too small. It is an old working-class neighborhood whose settler population of Irish, Scottish, and French-Canadian workers experienced dramatic industrial growth through the 19th and early 20th centuries, followed by deindustrialization and now gentrification in ways I'll describe in a moment. Particular stories of place are always very important to me as context and understanding for my material practice. Writer Rebecca Solnit is one of my favorite thinkers about the role that place plays in our lives. She writes so beautifully that I'm going to quote her at length here. We often talk about love of place, by which we mean our love for places, but seldom of how the places love us back, of what they give us. They give us continuity, something to return to, and offer a familiarity that allows some portion of our own lives to remain connected and coherent. They give us an expansive scale in which our troubles are set into context, in which the largeness of the world is a balm to loss, trouble, and ugliness. The bigness of the world is redemption. And so it may be that after the rupture of leaving Toronto, I was seeking, a certain kind of redemption as I began my investigation of my new Montreal places, discovering what they mean to me and how they reflect me. I want to respond to Solnit's point that places offers continuity and familiarity, perhaps, but cities are in fact about perpetual change and contingency, realities that can challenge that sense of continuity. That said, I seek to find the traces of continuity within the change, to acknowledge the past within the present, as you will see. As an artist, I began the regular kinds of research that many of us do as we develop place-based work. I read through texts, spoke with longtime residents, connected with the Neighborhood Historical Society, and looked at dozens and dozens of historical photographs and maps. And I walked, particularly along the banks of the Lachine Canal, which separates Point St. Charles from the rest of the city. The Lachine Canal was a product of industrialization, a commercial transportation system that was built in the early 1800s to bypass the rapids of the St. Lawrence River and allow shipping and trade with ports along the Great Lakes waterways. The canal operated from 1825 to 1970, when it was closed in favor of the larger St. Lawrence Seaway system. For the duration, the canal was the heartland of industrial Montreal's shipping, processing, and manufacturing. Its neighborhoods were populated by workers who first built and then enlarged the canal twice, and labored in the factories and the local railway yards that were part of the commercial system. But as the canal was replaced by the St. Lawrence Seaway, local neighborhoods dramatically changed, deindustrializing and depopulating. Between 1959 and 1973, the adjacent communities lost 38% of their manufacturing jobs. Point St. Charles, my neighborhood, was particularly hard hit with the closure of Northern Electric in 1974, Redpath Sugar, 1976, Sherwin-Williams, 1984, Stelco, 1985, and Atelier CN Alstom in 2003. Unemployment reached almost 20% in 1986. As the jobs left, so did the people. The Southwest Borough lost almost half its population between 1961 and 1991. In 2001, the families that remained in the Point earned on average just 60% of the annual wage of a family elsewhere in the city. These eventualities contributed to Point St. Charles being one of the most economically marginal areas of Montreal, and that's still true today. Only in the new millennium has the population and its income begun to inch upward, a direct result of the gentrification of the lands adjoining the Lachine Canal. So if that was the canal then, this is it now. Post-industrially, the terrain along the canal has been developed by its owner, the federal government, into a 14.5-kilometer linear park managed by Parks Canada. Through the past 4 decades, many of the industrial buildings alongside it have been transformed into high-priced residential housing. These condo conversions and accelerating new construction have sparked 2 decades of trenchant anti-gentrification struggles in the neighborhoods. As for the park itself, its notable amenity is this multi-purpose path, which you see here for biking, blading, walking, visited by humans more than 1 million times each April to November season. From spring through fall, the canal side is a site of sports and leisure, music festivals, community picnics. It can be very active, sometimes even prohibitively busy on fine warm days. But in the winter, when paths are not cleared of snow and ice, wheeled vehicles can't get through, and there is a much quieter vibe along the canal. It's a place where human history and activity recedes a bit, and natural elements are foregrounded. With no bikes and very few human visitors, the winter version of the Lachine Canal becomes a place where I can let my dog run off-leash and enjoy his pleasure in the place, which amplifies my own and connects me even more deeply to the terrain. So I love his wildish joy, counterpoint to the controlled and structured strictures of dense urban living. It was with this experience of our winter walks in particular, it was this experience that I wanted to bring into the map of the Lachine Canal. Overall, my series of maps aims to explore what cultural theorist Donna Haraway would call becoming with, her description for the way that we humans, as well as species of all kinds, living or not, are consequent on a subject and object shaping dance of encounters. That's pure Donna Haraway. What that means is that we are all bodies in the same dynamic ecosystem, profoundly connected on a cellular level, whether we acknowledge it or not. My maps start with available and authoritative sources of information about the site in question. In this case, I turned first to online images, the maps of the canal and adjacent territories posted by Parks Canada, which, as I mentioned, manages the site. I was intrigued to see these include historical information about the use and transformation of the buildings near the canal, at least until 2009 when these maps were made. So in case you can't see it at this scale, the various names of the buildings as they were commercially, industrially back in the day, and then with their new condominium branded name, appear on many of the different structures figured there. Maps are wonderful things. Like photographs, they tend to present as objective information, but in fact, as cultural geographer Brad Harley reminds us, maps are never value-free images. They always reflect the biases and interpretations of the cartographer. They can be seen as backhanded self-portraits. Maps are a perfect vehicle to explore questions of knowledge, its transmission, and the power structures embedded therein. Also implicit within mapping are considerations of our relationship with place, of human frailty and human mobility, and issues of representation itself. For all these reasons and more, maps are much beloved of artists, myself included. Writing about artists' works with maps, journalist Stephen S. Hall has stated, "It is hard to look at a map without sensing in our bones private hopes and secret fears about change." Perhaps it is no accident that I started this mapping project not long after the substantial life change of moving back to Montreal after 2 decades in Toronto. While the Parks Canada map incorporated indications of neighborhood change across the decades, it was badly out of date even 4 years after its creation. Those were done in 2009, and I started on that particular map in 2013. Additional transformation of the space was rampant, with the few remaining industrial buildings being redeveloped as condominiums and a lot of infill buildings being erected on previously empty sites or on sites where industrial buildings had been destroyed to make way for new structures. I wanted to represent this particular moment of change in my own map and include my dogs and my interpolations into the space. Working in textiles seemed particularly appropriate since many of the gentrified buildings had once been textile mills, Dominion Textile, Belding Corticelli, Canadian Bag Company. I built my map in 2 panels representing 2 specific web pages on the Parks Canada site. This is the terrain of our regular walking grounds from the de l'Église Bridge in the west to the Wellington Bridge in the east, with the Atwater Market, the linchpin, in the middle. Looking at this detail of work in progress here, I hope you can make out the map's various components, the quilt-like assembly of pieces of fabric to represent the canal in blue, the linear park in green, and the various building structures cut from silks, satins, and organzas in shapes that are specific and to scale. Overlaid on some structures is a gauze of pink to represent buildings that in 2013-14 were experiencing change, gentrification, and of red, which is more noticeable in other panels, to denote buildings entirely for rent, for sale, or abandoned, and so likely to be redeveloped next. In other words, I updated Parks Canada and Google Maps with information from my own lived experience of the place as I walked through these streets alone and with my dog. Into this assembled surface, I stitched with a digital embroidery machine the texts of the map to name the buildings, streets, bridges, locks, and neighborhoods to indicate scale and direction. The precision and meticulousness of the digital stitching reflects the objectivity of its content. I updated the 2009 labels with more recent content from 2013-14, new named condo developments, Le Canal, Le William, Urbe. This digitally stitched layer was then ready to receive the next step of work, a hand-stitched representation of the routes of my dog's off-leash walks, bringing the wildish into the more structured. The drawings of these routes were created by Baloo himself, who I set up with a harness and my iPhone using a GPS tracking app. So you can see him here with the phone on his shoulder. The app is called Map My Dog Walk, although I'm not sure that people planned that to be used as a basis for artwork, but you take what you can get. Anyway, it traced his specific trajectories. His routes have many more loops, curls, and detours than mine do, and that's part of what interested me, of course. This is a blow-up of the screen of one of his routes, and not all the small turns are visible here, but you can zoom in and get some of that more articulated detail that I then represented in the stitching. This is the pattern for his walks that I overlaid over the map with tracing paper and then stitched through to represent them, to get them right onto the textile itself. But I enlarged the scale of Baloo's paths so that they fill the full space of the composition, transcending the built structures. I didn't want his walks to be to scale. I wanted his walks to be big. Partly as a reminder that the animal and wildish layer of life here long predated our human interventions, and partly my wish to emphasize our continuing obligation to environmental stewardship and care. Imagine if we looked after our planet as well as we looked after our most beloved and respected animal companions. I chose a different color of yarn for each of a handful of walks, allowing the viewer to differentiate a particular route. By hand stitching our walking routes as well as representing the places themselves, my series of maps, this map of course here, becomes a trail of breadcrumbs of Baloo's and my linked experiences. The map reflects our histories of walking in this urban green space, aiming to explore questions of knowledge and translation, but more profoundly, questions of love and belonging, and how these and the artist's self may be constituted in a postmodern ethical framework that considers political ecologies and ecologized politics. Here you can see the completed work in the two linked panels. So, yeah. I'll close with two remarks. One relates to a moment of realization during 2014's winter mapping. While I'd been considering that the post-industrial canal was essentially a site of leisure at this time, I suddenly realized that a certain labor remained. At the construction sites along the canal, no matter what the weather, workers were busy erecting homes for others. All through the winters of 2014 and 2015, the workers were there, braving the cold and bearing witness to the daily life along the canal in a strange 21st century echo of the 19th and 20th century daily industrial bustle. I'm not sure yet how this changes the map for me, but I may try to collect some interviews with these workers to add some subtle shading to my own understanding of the context. Finally, this work and my multiple reflections on it have me thinking about the role of beauty in art and scholarship and its importance in the consideration of my maps as self-portraits. Beauty is one impulse behind my and many, many other artists' visual works. That said, beauty is much mistrusted these days, along with the desire and pleasure that it evokes and responds to. Nevertheless, I hope that we can learn to trust our desires and lean in, as the jargon has it, to what we love, to the beautiful, because doing so can be the basis not just of enjoyment and ethical relations, but also of social justice and considerate change. Theorists suggest that enabling this connection is exactly what beauty or enchantment can do. Art writer Dave Hickey, for one, reminds us that by offering visual pleasure without restraint or discrimination, the beautiful, quote, remains a potent instrument for change in this civilization, unquote. Similarly, philosopher Jane Bennett observes that the mood of enchantment may be valuable for the kind of ethical life that would have us more engaged with the human and more than human world around us. With these ideas in mind, I would not dismiss our attractions to the sites that claim us as a sort of de-industrial porn, which is a term that's going around a lot, since I think that doing so might disrespect both those sites with their textured and lived histories and our own potential for ethical engagement with that which we love. We don't want a covert iconoclasm to inadvertently serve a neoliberal purpose, which would be to dismiss the value of these sites, the people and creatures previously and currently connected to them, and our feeling for this messy mishmash. I hope that we can trust what we love and do the hard and thrilling work of ethical engagement from Donna Haraway's standpoint of becoming with. For it is in doing so, I think, that we reveal who we are and make our works and our lives a shifting self-portrait.